Bienvenidos a Tres Respuestas, un espacio de conversación, de opinión y de propuestas. Nuestra invitada de hoy es Emma Sky, una de las expertas a nivel mundial más reconocidas en resolución de conflictos, en seguridad nacional, en el manejo también de situaciones de riesgos geopolíticos y además de su larga trayectoria también académica y diplomática y a través de organizaciones no gubernamentales. Emma Sky lidera el Centro de Liderazgo de la Escuela Jackson de la Universidad de Yale, y dentro de sus responsabilidades está también los programas de los fellows que atienden muchos de los grandes retos internacionales. Ha tenido dentro de su grupo de fellows a personas que se han destacado en la política, en la administración pública, en el sector privado, y una de ellas ha sido también nuestra querida amiga María Corina Machado. Así que Emma Sky es una defensora de la libertad. Emma, such a pleasure to have you in Tres Respuestas.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, when people read your curriculum and they find so many amazing things that you've done and how you've been involved in crisis management, crisis resolution, conflict resolution, people would like to know, how has Emma Sky been able to meet all these many accomplishments, and how was her life process in order to become so successful?
Well, thank you very much. When students say, how did you get to become you? It's a difficult question to answer. But I also think I'm a product of my education, and I'm a product of the era in which I came of age. So what do I mean by that? I was fortunate enough to be a student at Oxford University, and it was a very exciting time. It was the end of the Cold War. So while I was a student, the Berlin Wall came down. It was the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela released from prison, and an optimism about the world. And it was also the time of the first Intifada breaking out in Gaza and then the West Bank. And as a young person, I was searching for purpose in life. And I decided my purpose in life was going to be to help to bring about peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And in the context of that time, that was when the Madrid conference kicked off the Middle East peace process. And it really did seem that all the problems of the world were going to be resolved. We thought it was liberal democracy from here on out. And as a person coming of age in this world, I really wanted to be of help and of use. So I had gone to Oxford to study classics, and then I changed from classics, Latin and Greek, to Middle East. So I was going to study Middle East history, the politics, Arabic and Hebrew, the literature, and hopefully go out into the world to be a useful person in the world. So that's the context in which I graduated. And my first job actually out of Oxford was working for the refugee working group of this Middle East peace process. And the dream then, this was 1991, the dream then was that within 10 years, nobody in the Middle East would consider themselves a refugee. And that gives you an indication of the optimism and the hope of the time. And I went all around refugee camps in Gaza and the West Bank in Jordan, meeting with Palestinian refugees, getting to understand their aspirations, their hopes, what services they had, what more did they need, what did they want. And, that was my first job. Then when the Oslo Accords were signed on the White House lawn in September 1993, that was a hugely optimistic moment. And I moved out to Jerusalem and thought, I'm going to be here until there is peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And I thought that would take 5 years maximum. I could only imagine one outcome, and that was 2 states for 2 peoples. So I moved out to Jerusalem, and it was a time when there was a lot of donor interest in helping build up the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. So I'd work half the week in Gaza, half the week in the West Bank, really helping to build up these institutions the Ministry of Planning, of Finance, Statistics, then the Parliament, the Legislative Council, and also initiatives that brought Israelis and Palestinians together, people-to-people activities, preparing, these territories for statehood. That was the hope. And again, as a young person, I was hugely optimistic. I was there, I met Yasser Arafat a few times. I was there when he came to Jericho and met him in Gaza because we were helping build up the civil service. And I was also at a demonstration in Tel Aviv in, I think it was November the 4th, 1995, when people from across the country had come together to urge and to demonstrate their support for the peace process. And this was an amazing demonstration. There were 200,000 people gathered there, waving Israeli flags, waving Palestinian flags, calling for peace. And it was there when the Prime Minister of the time, Yitzhak Rabin, got up onto the stage and he sang this song, Shir Shalom, the Song of Peace. He had a terrible voice, really bad singing voice, but he was singing, the crowd was singing, there was this real sense of optimism. And then when he left the stage and went towards his car, a Jewish extremist stepped forward and shot him dead. And this Jewish extremist believed that man could not give up the land that God had given to the Jews. And this event was devastating. I'd always thought up till then that all it took for evil to conquer was for good people to do nothing. And then you had all these good people who were really urging for peace, doing everything they could to bring about peace. And this event happened. And then that was followed by terrorist attacks from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, blowing up buses. And Israelis became fearful, and extremists on both sides torpedoed the peace process. And everything that we'd been working at to build up was destroyed. And by this time the second Intifada broke out in 2001, I just felt it's impossible now. And I left. And that was a big, it was a sad moment. And that's when I just thought, there's nothing more I can do here. So I went back to work in the UK, and shortly after was 9/11. And there was lots of questioning, like, why did they hate us? What led to the attacks? And I thought, I've been spent a decade in the Middle East. I can answer some of those questions. And when the decision was taken to invade Iraq, even though I was very much against the war, I volunteered to go and serve in Iraq. So I ended up working in the province of Kirkuk as the governorate coordinator, which was really sort of the acting governor of the province. And then I became the political advisor to the top American generals in Iraq, General Odierno, General Petraeus. And so I spent a long time in Iraq, and I left Iraq sort of 2010, really not knowing what I was going to do next. And the Arab Spring broke out, so I thought, I've got no job, I've got no income, no purpose, let me follow the revolutions. And so I spent a year traveling around following the revolutions, and I was asked to come and give a lecture at Yale by an American general, General McChrystal, who was teaching here. So he knew me from Iraq. He asked me to give a lecture, so I gave a lecture about the Arab Spring, another one about the Middle East peace process. And then Jackson said, would you come and teach at Yale? So that's how I ended up unintentionally teaching at Yale University, which is where we met.
Emma, is so interesting, inspiring, and admirable, the career that you have exercised throughout your life, and also that commitment to peace. And based on the story that you just shared with us, I would love to ask, how do you think there can be a real construction of lasting peace in Gaza, Israel, West Bank? And what elements do you think have to be built in order for create the right level of trust that this requires?
It's a very, very difficult question. And I wish I had an easy answer to give to you. It's a different era now. I think in the 1990s, there really was an opportunity for peace because the environment of the time was one in which it was more conducive. The populations in Israel and Palestine had both moved towards the realization that the best solution was 2 states for 2 peoples. You had America's unipolar moment, so America had the potential to really help bring that about. But that moment has passed, and a lot of things have happened in between. October the 7th didn't come from nowhere. It came from a century of efforts that tried and failed. It came from a sense of huge humiliation that Palestinians feel. And it came after the failed peace process of the 1990s that I had been there for. And I think in the 1990s, the conflict was much more about land. You had 2 secular groups, if you like. The Palestinians were led by Fatah and the PLO, and the Israelis were led by the Labour Party and Likud to a bit. But it was much more a secular issue, a land dispute. And when you have a land dispute, then it's about the negotiations of where you draw the border. The failure of the peace process in the 1990s has led to a situation where the Palestinian Authority, which is sort of based out of Fatah, has been shown itself unable to deliver. It put everything behind 2 states. It was unable to deliver that. And Hamas, an extremist Islamist group, took control of Gaza. And on the Israeli side, they've moved from sort of left secular politics much more towards the right. And the current government has Jewish extremists within it who, like the guy who assassinated Rabin, really believes that the land has to be settled by Jews. And so you have a Jewish extremist belief that the land from the river to the sea must be Jewish, and a Hamas religious extremist view that the land from the river to the sea must be ruled by Muslims. And this is a clash of sacred values, if you like, and it's very hard to find a compromise. So where do we go from here is the question that you asked me. And you need a change in politics on both sides. So how to get a change in Israeli politics? That change can come about through elections, through democracy. A new leadership, a new belief that the extremists in Jewish society must be kept on the fringe and not be allowed to capture the state and have huge influence over the government. They are a minority and they have much greater power than their numbers suggest. And on the Palestinian side, how do you develop a new Palestinian leadership that believes in peace and coexistence and is willing to, pursue that type of strategy? And it's not obvious how you get there on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian Authority, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas was elected, 20 odd years ago for 4 years, and there hasn't been elections since. And it's not clear if there were elections, who would win, and would that be a Hamas government, which the West and Israel would refuse to deal with? So how do you help build up new Palestinian leadership, new Palestinian politics that believes that there is a political way to dignity, a political way to safety and security? And that is a challenge. It's not impossible. It is just very, very hard. And for the little bits of hope that we can see, I think comes from the coalition of Arab countries that believe that Hamas cannot continue to rule Gaza. There needs to be an alternative. Hamas as a military force needs to be ended. As a political force, it's part of the Muslim Brotherhood, is very much part of Middle East politics. So it needs to give up the military bit and become just the political force. But Hamas cannot be allowed to rule Gaza again after what happened. So the pathway is very, very difficult. You have two sides that that really distrust each other. And within the Palestinian side, there is a civil war between Hamas and Fatah. And on the Israeli side, a very divided society indeed. And so they need healing of their own societies. They need reconciliation within their own societies, and then reconciliation with each other. So there's no quick fixes to this. It needs a third party. It needs a buffer in between them to allow those changes to happen.
Emma, based on what you just said, the idea of building a lasting peace and a structural governance in Gaza starts with recognizing that Hamas has been an anti-Semitic organization that in its foundational charter, they've always advocated for the elimination of the Israeli state and the Jewish people. The fact that they have conspired against any possible two-state solution, it's pretty much evident. So how would you, based on your experience and also the advice that you've provided in multiple situations, how do you believe a strong governance without Hamas in the Gaza Strip, based on a future creation of lasting peace and reconciliation, can take place? What would be, if you were to advise how to structure the right governance for Gaza in order to build the confidence of a peace agreement that allows the two states to exist and to prosper, what would you recommend?
There needs to be a political horizon. Over the last 20 years or so, the Israeli government pursued a policy of trying to keep Hamas in power in Gaza and Fatah weak within the West Bank. And this was a very dangerous policy. Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, was unable really to get land recovered. It was unable really to protect its citizens, and it was unable to get prisoners out of jail, and it was unable to get rights of access to the mosque in Jerusalem. So this gave Hamas the platform to say, look, we can get prisoners out by kidnapping Israelis and doing prisoner exchange. We took the fight to Israel. So Hamas was able to maneuver and present itself as the leaders of the Palestinian movement. And in so doing, they have brought complete disaster to Palestinians. What has happened in the war in Gaza since October the 8th, 2023, has been horrific, and it has been an absolute disaster for the people who are living in Gaza. And you can see the enmity and anger that people in Gaza feel towards Hamas for the disaster that has been brought upon them. Hamas knew it was going to provoke an Israeli overreaction. It wanted to provoke that to get the world on its side, to get the world to remember the Palestinians. And so in a way, the worst or the most violent that Israel is within Gaza, it adds to the sympathy that the Palestinian cause has around the world. So Hamas, after what Hamas has done, cannot be allowed to continue governing Gaza. So a big part of this is, how do you listen to the voice of Palestinians? They didn't have a vote on October the 7th. They didn't know what was coming. So how do you get to hear the Palestinian voice? How do you consult with ordinary Palestinians inside Gaza about the future that they want to live in, the future that they want for their children, their aspirations? And I think that is key. And a lot of the plans being put forward at the moment for Gaza are all technical. Yes, this needs to be rebuilt or that needs to be built. But they're not dealing with the politics. Palestinians are not sitting there as passive recipients of our benevolence. They need to be included in it, in the reconstruction, in discussions of, you can imagine there needs to be a council for Gaza. Its representation could be from the families, the traditional families of Gaza, from different unions, different associations, and from each town to make sure each town and refugee camp is represented. And there's always been local governance in Gaza as well, so you could have local committees. But there needs to be Palestinians involved in deciding how the reconstruction is going to happen. Do you build a hospital here or a hospital there? The water, getting the energy, all of these things are trade-offs, and Palestinians need to be involved in the discussions rather than well-meaning foreigners just ignoring them and rebuilding without involving them in the discussions. So I think the bit which, in the plans that I've seen being put forward are very technocratic, and what is missing is the Palestinian involvement and the Palestinians' representation.
Do you believe that in a process of governance, there can be a transition government supported by the Arab countries, the international community, maybe having a special envoy assuming that transitionary role until the governance structure goes back to a democratic, committed to the rule of law structure that would give confidence to Israel? And if that it might be the case, what's your opinion about the possibility, for example, of Tony Blair playing that role?
I think, you can look at experiences we had, particularly in Iraq. And initially in Iraq, we were the ruling authority. The Coalition Provisional Authority was the ruling authority. But the legitimacy of that authority was questioned right from the beginning. So the first question is, if there is to be an international body, where does it get its legitimacy from? Will that be something that is voted by the UN or the Arab League or friendly Arab countries? Where would the legitimacy come from? Who would head up this authority is a question, obviously, and who decides and who chooses who heads up that authority. Brits have a long history in the region, and it's a history fraught with difficulties. And Palestinians are quick to remember, the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And they're quick to recall all the grievances that they have against the UK. So I think it has to be, you can imagine it will be an international coalition that is given legitimacy by the way in which it is appointed and also by having a limited time frame. So for an interim period before it is handed over to a Palestinian authority. Now, doing all of that is going to be extremely difficult because we're living in this era of great power competition. And will the Russians and the Chinese be supportive? How do you get the international community on board? So it's very difficult to do this, but you can't just go ahead and rebuild without having any legitimacy.
Emma, if the Palestinian Authority plays a strategic role My worry is that in the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah have never, in the last 25 years, gained the trust and the legitimacy. You, in fact, mentioned that Mahmoud Abbas has been there without having elections in a long time. What role do you think the Palestinian Authority can effectively play in Gaza? And what would give the legitimacy? Because, Mahmoud Abbas is an old guy already, and even though he looks healthier than anybody could have expected, the fact is that there's uncertainty about who's going to take the leadership once Mahmoud Abbas it's out of his capacities to run the Palestinian Authority. And at some point, people thought Fayyad was going to be the person, but Fayyad did not gain the stamina and the maybe the character that the situation required. So I don't know if this is going to make things more complex, and I would love to see what ideas would you like eventual leadership in Fatah, so that the transition can take place with a legitimacy and an authority that is able to do the reconstruction and sell a vision that is a stability and prosperity for the future.
It's very difficult. Palestinian politics used to be very vibrant. There were all these different trends within Palestinian politics. Within Fatah, you had old guard, young guard, all these different trends. There used to be elections. And what's happened for 20 years is people who had different views left. And Fatah has become sclerotic. Palestinian Authority has become sclerotic. And it's very difficult to see how it reforms from where it's at. So another way that could be considered is the reform of the Palestinian Authority, not from West Bank into Gaza, but maybe starts in Gaza, and the new movement then expands to the West Bank as well, with new people, new faces, and this is going to be extremely difficult to do and takes time. Salam Fayyad, who you mentioned, was a fantastic individual. He'd worked for years for the World Bank, highly trained, highly competent. And yet he was given a very hard time by the Palestinians and also by the Israelis. Both sides were not trying to help him be successful. So things really do need to change, and they do need to evolve. And at the moment, we have this opening. I can say it's a slight opening in that the violence in Gaza has stopped. There is a ceasefire. The hostages are back. The prisoners have been released. And the only way that the two sides got to phase one was by the intervention of the US and creating this horizon that would say, first, let's release the hostages and the detainees. Then let's move to the reconstruction of Gaza and an interim security force and an international presence, and then move towards stage 3, which will be the development of a two-state solution, a Palestinian entity of some sort that would give dignity and security and allow the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people to be met. But this is extremely hard.
Let me now change the topic a little bit, but also based on reconstruction, peace building, stability, and institutional capacity. Next year is going to be 25 years since September 11. And also, there's an experience that took place in Afghanistan that, in my opinion, I think it has been a failure just because all the radicalism is back leading the country. When you look at the Taliban and their behavior and the kind of institutionality that they promote, which is all based on authoritarianism and persecution of women and so on. And we're going to be getting closer next year also to 23 years since the invasion of Iraq, and also the change of governance from dictatorship to a kind of democracy. And it's still being questioned whether the institutionality is strong. How would you judge those two processes based on your experience? Are they failures, or they can be presented as relative success in terms of transition and peace building?
Afghanistan has definitely been a failure. The US, the NATO coalition, removed the Taliban and then withdrew 20 years later, and the Taliban is back in power. So there's no question that Afghanistan intervention has been a failure. With Iraq, I think it's a different picture. And I say this as someone who's just got back from holiday in Iraq. And back in 2010, I was with President Barzani, the Iraqi president, or the president of Iraqi Kurdistan at the time, staying in his summer guest house. And he pointed to the nearby mountain. He said, over there, Korek, we're going to build a 5-star hotel. And I looked and I thought, who on earth is going to come to Iraq on holiday? And there I was 15 years later in Iraq on holiday with a group of 30 people from all over the world. And we were hiking the Zagros mountain trail in Iraqi Kurdistan. And, I tell you that story because people's image of Iraq is often stuck when it was last on the news. And when it was last on the news, it was often for negative things. But if you think in this last year, when there have been the changes and bombings in Lebanon, the overthrow of the regime in Syria, Israel's bombing of Iran, all of these things, the Houthis kicking off in Yemen, Iraq was silent. And that's extraordinary. A country that had always been at the forefront of violence and ISIS and Shia militias has been silent over these last 2 years. And so Iraq has elections regularly, and these elections, the results of the elections, are upheld in recent years, and sometimes new prime ministers come in. There seems to be agreement among the elites about how power should be shared. And that has put an end to the power struggle that happened for years and years and years. But for the last 10 years or so, the agreement on how power should be shared has been upheld. The institutions have stuck and they're getting stronger. The security forces, with minimal support from the West, have prevented a resurgence of ISIS and have kept the country stable. And the levels of construction are amazing. Baghdad is booming, construction everywhere. Basra, which was very depressed, now has got new cafes, new restaurants. So the story of Iraq is ongoing. And, the war was fought on the belief that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, which proved to not be true. But the long-term prognosis for Iraq is actually looking okay. So when you look at other countries in the region, Iraq now is seen as the more stable one. In Baghdad, there's politics. It's not about which king or which royal member of the royal family. There's really politics and people in debate. And you've got a media that's, all different political parties. There's lots of things to criticize the media for, but there's not one voice. All these different political parties are debating, they're arguing. So Iraq, maybe I could say it's too early to tell which way Iraq is going. But at the moment, it seems to be doing okay. And Iraqis are optimistic about their future. They're hopeful. They're not living in fear. Security is much, much better. General Petraeus was actually there last week, back in Baghdad. First time he'd been there for years, and was very surprised by what he saw. So not the outcome, the war should never have been fought because it was fought on the wrong assumptions. But the Iraqi people may be better off than they would have been under Saddam. The majority of the Iraqi people, not all of them, of course, because some have suffered horribly. And Iraq's role in the region, it changed the balance of power in the region in Iran's favor. But now Iraq is becoming more of a buffer rather than a client of Iran. And as Iran gets weaker and Iraq gets stronger, Iraq is playing a more balancing and positive role in the region.
Emma, you've also analyzed the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. You've analyzed all possible options for peace building, and obviously the great question is, how can that conflict be solved, considering that Russia invaded Ukraine, that Russia has been trying to take territory away in a sequentially way, in a systematic way, in a methodic way over the last decade. And the question for peace building is, how do we define success? Because for Putin, success is keeping the Donbass. For Zelensky, success is pushing out the Russians. But there's also a fatigue. There are all more than 1 million people that have been affected, directly wounded or killed. And this is horrendous because since the Vietnam War, we hadn't seen numbers that could have been more than 1 million people within just 3 years. So I would love to ask you, if you were to draft any possible solution for peace building in between Ukraine and Russia, what will be your premises and how you think success can be defined for both countries?
That's, again, a very difficult question to answer. And, you've been involved in these discussions. Lots of us have been involved in these discussions. And what would be the sort of outcome that would allow Putin to save face, that would allow Zelensky to save face? What would be the golden bridge? What would be the speeches that they could give to their people? And how would that come about? And so many things have been tried. We live in this era which is very concerning. My colleague at Yale, Arnie Westad, he's got this book coming out called The Coming Storm. And in this book, he compares what we're seeing today with the beginning of the 20th century. And it's like a wake-up call in a way, because most people living today have either lived in a period of remarkable stability, presided over by, one of two superpowers. And that world was predictable. But today we're living in a world where the great powers are, they're competing for regional supremacy. They want advantage in tech, in nuclear tech, in artificial intelligence, in space exploration, in trade. So the world is becoming more and more and more unpredictable. And he compares that with the beginning of the 20th century, when the great powers wanted regional dominance, when nationalism, populism was on the rise, that many felt fearful or left behind by globalization. They were fearful of immigration and terrorism. And it's like, oh my God, all the things that we have today were also, a century ago. And I'm bringing that up in the context of Russia-Ukraine, Because some would argue we're already going into World War III. And it's a warning. Because the architecture that we've been living under was created at the end of World War II. You think back to Roosevelt and Churchill and trying to ensure that we would never have a World War III again. And they came together with the creation of the United Nations and all these institutions for trade and air and health across every aspect that would manage competition and manage cooperation between all the different countries. And that architecture presented the balance of power at the time. But it's no longer fit for purpose, and the balance of power in the world has changed. You know, at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I thought, here's a chance for China to step forward and be the power that mediates an end to that war. But in a way, China has really taken the side of Russia, and Russia's been pushed more and more into China's orbit. And we're left with a situation which is hugely problematic. I think at the beginning of the war, the West was very optimistic. Putin had made the West great again, had made NATO great again as everything came together. But Russia has gone on to a war economy, and its military industrial base is really been producing, where Europe still is unable to have one thing that brings everybody together. So all these countries are doing their own productions and they're not investing enough. And of course, President Trump is not predictable. And one moment he seems to be taking Putin's side, and another moment he's taking Zelensky's side, and it goes back and forth, back and forth. Now, obviously, the resolution to this conflict matters, because there's a fear that if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine, no country bordering Russia is safe. And so other countries are fearful. And if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine, will they bend the knee there? And what will that say to America's allies out in the Pacific? So all these things are connected.
Emma, listening to you is always fascinating, and time is running out, and I hope that we can continue this conversations. But I just want to finish by asking you something. You're an intellectual. You love to write, to read. For people who are listening to us and want to get involved into conflict resolution and trying to get the lessons from history in order to manifest a practitioner life in terms of peace building, what books would you recommend for people to read to get the right lessons in order to be applicable to multiple circumstances? What would be those books that you would say, you know what, for someone who wants to work in peace building, at least you should have these 3 books right close to you?
3 books. Well, you could start with Thucydides. Start by reading these stories of, these ancient wars. Because what drives war hasn't really changed over the centuries. Fear, grievance, interest. These things are all there. There's something about this human condition. We are competitive animals. So how do you create a context in which that competition can take place non-violently? What are the mechanisms that are important for that? So Thucydides would be one. I'm a great believer in the works of William Ury. And William Ury is a negotiations guru who wrote this book when he was just in his 20s, getting to yes. But he's produced a book last year called Possible. So if you ask William, are you an optimist or a pessimist? He'll say neither. I'm a possibilist. And by being a possibilist, you're looking at it's not some Pollyanna-ish thing about I can solve all of these problems, but you can help make things less bad. And so it's a way of thinking, of looking for those moments, looking for the openings, looking at how do you help find a pathway to possible. And a pathway to possible, in his methodology, you zoom out. You get a wider perspective on what is happening. You look to that golden bridge of trying to find some solution. You look to the victory speech that a leader is going to give to their people. But he also talks about a third side, which are the supporters of peace, ordinary people. How do you come out in support of coexistence? How do you come out in support of cooperation? Since October the 7th, our campuses have been fraught with demonstrations. You're either pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestine. You want people to be pro-peace. You want all that energy to be to push the two sides together. If those of us who are not party to the conflict are taking extreme positions on either side, we are not of help. So how can we be those people who support and uplift the voices of moderation, the voices of compromise? So that would be my second book. And I was with William Ury actually in Iraq hiking, so he's very much in my mind. But I was also in Istanbul very recently at a meeting organized by Hakan Altunay, who's a Turkish intellectual. And he brought a group of people together to talk about trust and polarization. And one of those was an Indian scholar, academic, intellectual, social activist, social justice activist, a man by the name of Harsh Manda. And Harsh is an extraordinary man. I felt I was in the presence of the heir Mahatma Gandhi. And he spoke about radical love. And listening to him, it made me realize that all of us, as individuals, can strive in everything that we do each day to be better humans, to do those acts of kindness, to help people who are homeless, to stand up for the disadvantaged. There's things that we can all do, and not just focus on elite peacemaking, but to actually think as a citizen, what is it that I can do to be a better citizen, to be kinder, to be more generous? Because at the end of the day, what makes us happy, what makes us flourish, is helping others. And seeing Harsh, I came away thinking, wow, I need to do more, and I need to encourage everyone in my sphere to do more to help others.
Wow. What a great answer, Emma. And I'm really thankful for your insights, your reflections, for your friendship. And I really look forward for you to come to Colombia. I'll see you in Yale pretty soon. And it has been an honor to have you in Tres Respuestas. Thank you so much, Emma Sky.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.